Good morning, everyone. My name is Jody Allen, and I'm the Robert Francis Ings Director of the Lemon Project, A Journey of Reconciliation. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the final day of the 11th Annual Lemon Project Spring Symposium. Our theme this year is 4 Centuries of Black Women in America, Freedom, Activism, and Justice for All. Before we begin, I want to read the following 2 statements. William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the land our campus is on today. The Cherokees, Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Potomac, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal leaders, tribal members, past and present. Also, the Lemon Project stands with the rest of William and Mary in solidarity with our Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian colleagues and students to say that anti-Asian hate is unacceptable and has no place at William and Mary. And now it is my pleasure to share with you a video from our provost, Dr. Peggy Agoras. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 11th Annual Lemon Project Spring Symposium. This year's theme, 4 Centuries of Black Women in America, Freedom, Activism, and Justice for All, gives us an opportunity to highlight and celebrate the contributions of African American women since 1619. Last year, we had to cancel the symposium because of COVID, and we're excited that you can join us in this new virtual community. Too long overlooked, the symposium is focusing on Black women from all walks of life, with 10 panels by community members, academics, and students, keynotes by Dr. Christy Coleman, Dr. Catherine Meeks, and Dr. Karsonya Wise Whitehead, and student art. We will conclude the symposium with For Colored Girls Who Inspired the World, performances honoring the impact of Black women. This event is in collaboration with the Asian Centennial at William and Mary. As we recognize and address the dual pandemics of systemic racism and COVID-19, we also acknowledge William and Mary's responsibility to lead in addressing both. I became William and Mary's 6th provost on July 1st, 2019. And as the university's chief academic officer, one of my responsibilities is to oversee the Lemon Project, a journey of reconciliation. Since I arrived, I've been learning about the importance of the Lemon Project and its work. The initiative was the second institutionally funded project of its kind in the country, and is a thought leader in the national and international movement of universities dealing with the legacies of slavery on their campuses. The Lemon Project has accomplished much research as it builds bridges between William and Mary and the African American community in Williamsburg and the Tidewater area. Our Board of Visitors acknowledged and apologized that William and Mary enslaved people, exploited them in their labor, and perpetuated the legacies of racial discrimination. But our efforts towards reconciliation and healing are not over. As provost, I look forward to heartily supporting the Lemon Project, a journey of reconciliation for years to come. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks to our provost for that wonderful message. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Juwan Johnson, and thank you for joining us for the final day of the 11th Annual Lemon Project Symposium. In the words of our participants during our symposium coffee breaks, we've been inspired, uplifted, and empowered by the presentations on the lives and contributions of Black women. The stories we've heard are also a call to action to reimagine justice and to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world as stated by Dr. Angela Davis. In many ways, this quote encapsulates the life and work of Dr. Karsonya Wise Whitehead, whom I had the pleasure of hearing speak at the 2020 Asala Black History Month luncheon weeks before our world drastically changed. I was inspired by her commentary and what I later learned about her deep commitment to justice for all. Dr. Whitehead is the hashtag Black Mommy activist and an associate professor of communication and African American studies in the Department of Communication at Loyola University, Maryland. She is an award-winning radio host of Today with Dr. Kaye on WEAA, an op-ed columnist for the Afro-American newspaper based in Baltimore. She is the founding executive director of the Emily Francis Davis Center for Education, Research, and Culture. Dr. Whitehead is the author of 4 books: Notes from a Colored Girl, The Civil War Pocket Diaries of Emily Francis Davis, which received both the 2015 Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the Organization of American Historians, and the 2014 Latita Woods Brown Book Award from the Association of Black Women Historians. Race Brave was selected as one of the top 10 summer reads by the Baltimore Sun. Letters to My Black Sons, Raising Black Boys in a Post-Racial America, and Sparking the Genius, the Carter G. Woodson Lecture. The co-editor of Rethinking Emily Francis Davis, Lesson Plans for Teaching Her Civil Rights, Civil War Pocket Diaries, and Coleman, The Art Story. Dr. Whitehead's work has received both national and local recognition, including being recently selected as one of the 100 women advocating for change by Essence Magazine, and one of the 25 women to watch by the Baltimore Sun. She has also recently received the 2019 Associated Press Award for Outstanding Talk Show, the 2019 Collegium Visionary Award, and the 2019 Exceptional Merit Media Award. To that end, let's welcome Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead to this virtual stage.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you here today. I just want to note that it's such a wonderful time to be a Black woman. I am just happy being a Black woman, waking up every day and just giving thanks, knowing that I come from Black women who chose to survive. So in recognizing the shoulders that I stand on, I recognize my mother, who had to work hard to carve out a path for us as a pastor's wife, being in spaces where she was tried, in so many ways they tried to silence her. I stand on the shoulders of my Nana as one of the first Black nurses in South Carolina who showed up to vote on a regular basis and was sometimes beaten or arrested for trying to exercise her right to vote, who told me very quietly in my ear more than once that she was not voting for herself and she was not voting for her mother. She was voting for the children of her children, which meant she was voting for me. I stand here on the shoulders of my great grandmother, a woman who went blind at the age of 80 and said, I never saw racism clearly than when I went blind in this country, understanding that racism goes to the heart and the minds of people. And it has nothing to do with what you can see in the physical, but it's what you can see in the spiritual that will get you through. I stand here on the shoulders of my great grandmother. They called her Big Mama, Vanna. She was over 6 feet tall and she could vote because in South Carolina, racist Jim Crow South Carolina, in addition to all the laws they had on the books, they had one law that said if you were over 6 feet tall, you could vote. And so she would show up at 6 feet 2 inches and said, I can vote because the law, I've been told, said that I could. And I stand here on the shoulders of my great grandmother, the last Black woman in my family to be born enslaved, knowing that she made a choice every day to go forward rather than backwards. I am living in a world she never could have imagined, but she dreamed it was possible. So when I say that I am proud and I'm happy to be a Black woman, to be participating in an event that celebrates Black women, it's because I understand that survival is a part of who we are. Revolution runs through our veins, and it's every day that we have learned how to stand up straight in what they call a crooked room in this country. If we take a look at the history for the fire this time, playing off of James Baldwin's work, we note that we're sitting in a very interesting place historically, right? Not historically, but historically, that it was about 190 years ago that freedom fighter Nat Turner was hanged in Jerusalem, Virginia. Now, the US Census noted that the population stood at about 12.9 million people, with 2 million enslaved men, women, and children, and about 319,000 free Black folks in this country. Now, most of the free Black folks were sprinkled throughout the North, knowing that the South, as entrenched as it was, is where most of our people who were enslaved, where they lived out their life from the womb to the grave. It was about 151 years ago with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, that amendment that guaranteed Black men free access to the ballot that they've been fighting against every day since that happened. Let's be very clear. That was only 5 years after American slavery ended with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. It was only 4 years after the rise of the most terrorist group in this country, the start of the KKK. It was 149 years ago that race leader and suffragist Charlotte Rollin, a Black woman, joked that she should run for vice president of the United States. I think it's amazing that you're talking back at that time, 149 years ago, a Black woman was saying, I should run for vice president of this country. And even though she did not run in 1952, only 22 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed white women's access to the ballot. Let's be clear, Black women, Asian American women, and Hispanic women didn't get protection for the ballot until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Charlotta Bass ran for vice president. She was the first candidate for a national party. She ran as a vice presidential nominee for the Progressive Party. And it was about 49 years ago that Shirley Chisholm mounted her campaign for the White House. Now, she ran, of course, because she believed that she could win, but she often said afterwards that she knew she was not going to win. She knew that America was not going to send a Black woman to the White House back in 1972. She said she wasn't really running to win. She was running to pull together enough delegates to be able to walk into the office of whoever won and to be able to work hard on behalf of Black folks, Indigenous folks, and women. Now, to put that in context with Shirley Chisholm, when we think about why that's important to kind of really historically understand that, is that that was the same year that Joe Biden, our current president, actually joined the Senate as a young senator. He was the youngest in history to join the Senate, coming from Delaware. And Kamala Harris, our vice president, was in second grade. I bring that up because James Baldwin said it best. And when he talked about context matters, because history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us as we move forward. 2020 was a very challenging year. We had the violent deaths of unarmed Black men, women, children by the police and would-be vigilantes. We had the devastating impact of COVID-19 on the Black and brown communities. And we were dealing with feelings of anti-Blackness within our own community. We were dealing with feelings of racism and the oppression and the hostility that comes along with being Black in this country, dealing with policing and equity and justice. And so I am arguing that as we move forward, that there's some really hard questions that we need to wrestle with. Not as a slogan, not as a t-shirt, not as, the new Nike, anti-racist tennis shoes, but about what does it mean to live in this country at this very moment, just only a day or so after we had the reemergence of Jim Crow style laws. I'm calling them Georgia Crow laws. As we stand here knowing that the battle for equity and the battle for justice, at every time we have racial progress in this country, the white lash is racist policies and practices. Let me see if I can convince you of why I'm saying that. Take a look back, that when American slavery ended in 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, people saw that as a moment of racial progress. They had put on the table reparations to give to formerly enslaved people, knowing that you can't go forward in this country unless you have land, you have money, and you have the means of production. That's the 40 acres, the mule, and the $50. You get your land, you get your money, and you have your means of production with your mule. So that way you can work yourself into a better situation. The ratification of the 13th Amendment. But with that racial progress that happened, that continued with 1868 and the ratification of the 14th Amendment around civil rights and civil liberties, and then dealing with the ballot by the time you got to 1870, what you saw, the white lash to that, with racist policies, practices, procedures, and laws, was the rise of the KKK, a white domestic terrorist organization designed to frighten Black people, to terrorize Black people, and to remind Black people of their inferior situation. You have the rise of these type of organizations designed to stop racial progress. Every single time in this country, when there's racial progress, it's met with racist policies, practices, procedures, and laws. Let me give you another one. Think about Nat Turner's rebellion. The concern after Nat Turner's rebellion, after they caught and hanged everybody, right? They hung them all. White lash to that was setting up a law where it was illegal to teach Black folks how to read and write. Now, they didn't say enslaved people, or slaves is the term they used. They said Black folks. So even the fight to have education in the North was sometimes stifled by the laws on the books. We call that the white lash. Here's another one. In 1621, Elizabeth Key, a mulatto woman, her mother was an enslaved woman, her father was a European. Elizabeth Key, they said, could read and write. And she had recognized that in the colonies at that time, they followed English common law, which meant that you got your status, your legal status, you got your heir property from your daddy. So if your daddy was a free man, if your daddy was king, then that meant you had the right to the throne. You had the right to all the benefits that came along with that. Elizabeth Key sued Virginia's House of Burgesses. See, that's how you go against racist policies, practices, procedures, and laws. You go into the courtroom. We've seen that every step of the way. Elizabeth Key sued for her freedom and the freedom of her son. She said, look, according to English common law, I'm a free woman because my daddy is a European. He's not an enslaved man. And I'm using enslaved as more of a 21st century term, knowing that that was not the exact language that was used at that time. She sued and she won. Racial progress. She was the first one of the suits based upon English common law. Well, 1 year later in 1622, white lash happened. I always say Virginia is going to Virginia. Virginia that became, of course, the capital of the Confederate States of America. Virginia is going to Virginia. Because 1 year later in 1622, they enacted something called partus sequitur ventrum, which meant they changed English common law. You no longer got your legal status, your heir property from your daddy, you got it from your mother. Which meant if your mother was enslaved, from the time of conception, you already belonged to the plantation owner. You were, in a sense, enslaved from the womb to the grave. Well, what happened there is what Dr. Angela Davis talks about when she said they uniquely conjoined a Black woman's womb to economic production in this country. We moved, as Dr. Ira Berlin would say, we moved from being a society with slaves to being a slave society. A society with slaves, you had different modes of economic production, building the economic base, and slavery was one of them. When we became a slave society, slavery sat at the center of mass production. And what we found out and what we look back and see is that this country was built on the wombs of Black women. This idea that our wombs were considered to be a product, a project, a process for capital accumulation, that you have documentation from young white boys in Virginia, in North Carolina, who talk about growing up one day and buying a winch so they can build their economic base, because then they could have uncontestable access, as Dr. Davis said, to the bodies of Black women. They could rape a Black girl with impunity and then take her child and either sell it or grow it so you can build your economic base. They can have a Black woman raped with impunity and then take her child and either sell it or keep it or grow it to build your economic base. Every time there is racial progress, it's met with racist policies, practices, procedures, and laws. Come forward a little bit to the Tulsa race riots and the Tulsa race massacres. The whole idea around the burning of Wall Street was because of all of the racial progress and economic progress being made in Greenwood. That you had one of the richest towns in this country. You had at least 3 Black families who had their own airplanes. They had their own airline strip. They had their own churches. They had their own stores. Like, you had Black folks living free and economically supporting and benefiting one another. And it was followed by racist policies and practices, because white folks went in and did what? They burned it to the ground, devastated that community, never having to look back and pay for the damage that was done to that community. Every time we have racial progress in this country, it is met by racist policies, practices, procedures, and laws. I'm gonna give you one more, because I think we got to talk about Georgia Crow laws. What you saw in Georgia with the work of Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight and Natasha Brown, when you talk about, Black Voters Matter, when you talk about the young folks in Georgia, making sure that they got out to basketball courts, beauty salons, to make sure that Black folks understood the importance of their vote, that when they stood in line, here's water, here's food, you stand, you work, you need a ride, we've got you covered. Come out and help us show the world that anybody making their way through the White House has to come through the Black community, not just Black women, Black community as a whole. With the work of Black women, you understand the voice of Black women at that time. They showed up, they flipped Georgia blue. They sent the Black man to the Senate, racial progress. And what we saw just a day or so ago is the white lash to that with racist policy. Some of the most restrictive voter suppression laws to come on the books since the early 1960s. And we have to understand that when we look at the pathway to trying to have Black folks and brown folks as second-class citizens, it starts with disenfranchisement every single time. They strip them of the vote, and after that, all kind of laws, policies, practices, procedures follow with that, which is why it is so important. With me laying this out, I know that I only have about 30 or so minutes with you, and then we're going to have some Q&A. And so I will invite you to start putting your questions in chat, and Dr. Johnson will share them with me when we get to the Q&A portion of our discussion. I make the argument that every conversation in this country is a conversation about race, even when it's not. Because conversations about race are not about race, they're about people. And conversations about people in this country are messy, they're emotional, they're laden with racism and sexism and classism, xenophobia, bigotry. Every conversation in this country, particularly over the last 4 years, have been conversations about race, even when they were not. Race, as we all know, is not a biological concept. I just want to lay out the history of race very, very briefly. And I know for most of you, you've heard this before, but I think that when you show up for dinner, you need to be clear whether you're on the menu or you're a diner. And if you don't know what's going on, you end up on the menu. So I just want to lay out kind of briefly the history of race in this country, so we're at least all sitting as diners at the table when we get to the Q&A portion. Race is a social concept. It's a sociological construct that either denies or benefits a person. It gives you the access to be in the room where it happens, to pick up on what Lin-Manuel Miranda said in his song, that you can be in the room where it happens if at a certain point you were white, you were a man, you were considered to be cisgender, you were heterosexual, you're a Christian, you're able-bodied, you're educated, you're middle class, a landowner, you can be in the room where it happens. Now, although there's some dispute about the origin of the word race, As far as I can find, the first time it was used was back in 1508. And that was in a poem by William Dunbar, where he talked about the backbiters of sundry races. And when he was talking about race, he was talking about kinship groups. He was talking about groups of people. Now, that definition of race is not our definition of race today. Because as we understand and we analyze race today, we know that it's uniquely connected to social hierarchy in this country. It's uniquely connected to the economic foundation of this country. When we talk about what it means to be white and what it means to be Black in this country prior to the Civil War. We mentioned earlier in the introduction, we were talking about 1619. And I know everyone kind of gets the buzzword of 1619 because of the amazing work that Nicole Hannah-Jones did with the 1619 Project through the New York Times. But 1619, which as we know was 1 year before the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts. It was 224 years before we ratified the 13th Amendment. When the first 20 or so odd Africans set foot in Jamestown, Virginia. Now, if you're from South Carolina, like I am, we always push back against 1619 because we understand that there were enslaved people in South Carolina in 1444. But we use 1619 as a marker because that was the first connection to permanent American settlements, what we call the marking, the beginning of Africans in America. Now, it's interesting because it was not until 1624 that you had the first African being born in America. And all this is documented to understand how the triangular trade system, which brought out approximately 40 million plus African folks from their home. In many ways, you had all of the collusion happening with African chiefs, working with Europeans, stealing out bodies, and then scattering them throughout the Americas. A story that I would argue could never be fully documented. I say that because as someone who's been to Cape Coast and Dar es Salaam, one of the stories I used to hear in both of those places, Ghana and Senegal, was about the number of captured African women who chose to jump overboard rather than walk that plank out to a ship to be taken to a place where they don't know what's going to happen on the other side. We can't document their stories. We can't document the stories of the number of captured Africans who, when they were brought from the hull of the ship, chose to jump overboard rather than continue on this journey, which is why they said sharks would follow slave ships knowing that bodies, i.e. food, were going to come. We can't truly assess the real damage that slavery did to us. Not just once we got in this country, we were bought and sold, but also just the journey itself. There's a lot of work around post-traumatic slave syndrome, right? That PTSD that we talk about, and how we as Black folks need to heal from that. I'm arguing that we need to also have some post-traumatic plantation owner syndrome, because there is this sense, as plantation owners set up, that there was a racial hierarchy. They were better than us. They were sent here to lead us, to guide us, to rape us, to mutilate us, to enslave us, to be as parents to us as children, not property that's in a sense still human because we were being raped with impunity. That idea of a racial hierarchy based in so many ways in this religious theory continues today. Like part of the problem we're having right now with white supremacy is this belief that whiteness is supreme. Now, before you say, well, Dr. Kaye, I'm a white person and, I haven't owned anyone and I don't know, I'm still trying to figure it out. Look, we're talking about whiteness itself. Whiteness is a social construct. Whiteness is the notion that being white is the norm. Being white makes you superior. Being white means you have access. Being white means you should have everything better because you are white. Even if you're white and poor, no worries, at least you're not Black. Even if you're white and you're illiterate, no worries, at least you're not Black. It's a racial hierarchy. Whiteness itself is where the danger is, because whiteness continues to exist because it's held up by the terrorism through white supremacy, and it's based in white supremacist policies. Like, that's why whiteness even today continues. If you don't think whiteness was part of what happened with the Georgia Crow laws and how punitive it was in terms of not even being able to give people water and food, understanding that whiteness itself must be dismantled if we ever want to talk about true equity and justice in this country. Because as long as that remains, it doesn't matter about the laws, it matters about the final frontier, what I call the fourth evil, which is the hearts and minds of people. When we take a look at this notion of skin color becoming closely connected with social status and social conditions, America at that moment, I would argue, is when it really became two nations, one white and free, and the other Black and enslaved. It did not happen later with the Kerner Commission back in 1968, right? No, it happened back in 1622. As soon as you change the law and you tie a Black woman's womb to economic progress and a Black woman's womb to legal status, as soon as you did that, we became two nations, one white and free, the other Black and enslaved. And what I think is interesting, that in order for that to exist, I mean, you're talking 1622, slavery didn't end until 1865. Think about the generations upon generations who were born white, born with enslaved people, died with enslaved people, and they were led to believe that it was the norm, that it was not only God's will, it was their very right to do this because they were born in the body of a white person. Two nations, one white and free and therefore superior, one Black and enslaved, therefore inferior. Now, this terminology was used again. If you want to go forward, 1622, up to when we actually heard this terminology, which is in 1968. Now, this is important because when we talk about the point I laid out earlier, every conversation is a conversation about race, even when it's not, linked to my hypothesis that every time we have racial progress in this country, it is followed by racist policies, practices, procedures, and laws. There's always a white lash whenever there's racial progress. You get a Barack Obama, you're gonna get a Donald Trump. There's always a white lash. In 1967, the country was on fire. And I say that metaphorically, but there's a literal part of that as well, because there were actually fires happening within the inner city. There were race riots happening throughout the country. I want to use riots not in the way Lyndon Baines Johnson talked about it. I want to use riots the way Dr. King defined it, right? That a riot is a language of the unheard. 1967 was only 2 years after the ratification of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But that was signed into law by Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was surrounded by everybody. All the Black leaders were there. He was giving out pens, you know, the way Governor Hogan here in Maryland gave out pens when he signed the HBCU bill the other day, but really rejoicing that the Voting Rights Act was designed to give Black folks as a whole, Black women specifically, let's be clear, because we were the ones that were being denied access to that ballot box, along with Hispanic and Asian American women. We had free and unrestricted access to the ballot. It's why Malcolm X would talk about, give me the ballot or the bullet. What does that mean? The power of the ballot. And we have watched since 1965, this steady erosion of the teeth of the Voting Rights Act coming through the United States Supreme Court, and now what's happening with the Georgia Crow laws. 1967 was only, 3 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When we talk about the discrimination that was taking place, Lyndon Baines Johnson used his popularity. That's what they call, Joe Biden, the new Lyndon Baines Johnson, because you know where all the bodies are buried, right? So you can talk to your boys and you can get policies passed. Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65. But the country was still on fire. And Lyndon Baines Johnson was trying to figure out, what is going on? Why are we still in the midst of all of these issues? Why are they still marching? Why are they still protesting? Why are they still rioting? Like, how can we stop them? What do Black people want? Now, I will say that when he spoke on television, of course, with the speechwriter, he laid it out. He was a lot more polite than I am. I'm just going to paraphrase. He was saying, what do Black people want? So we can get them to stop and get them to fall in line with the program that I have laid out to show that I've brought this country together. So Lyndon Baines Johnson put together a commission of all white men to go find out what Black folks want, right? Well, what's happening in this country? Figure it out and come back and tell me. That was in the fall of 1967. Led by Otto Kerner, they released what's been called the Kerner Commission, because it was named after Otto Kerner, kind of a slang here. It was released only a month before Dr. King was assassinated. And they talk in this document. If you have time, I would say go read the whole thing. Like, it is fascinating because they talk about, the establishment of the ghettos. And they talk about how white folks are complicit in the establishment of the ghettos, leading to this division among the race. I mean, they were truly scathing in their language, saying, look, like, if we want to talk about what's wrong with Black folks, we got to talk about what white folks are doing to make things wrong in the Black community. I thought, if you want to talk about things that were just starting to be revolutionary in their documents, this was one of them. Now, it's not on the same level as the Combahee River collective statement. It's not revolutionary on that level, but it was, white men trying to wrestle with this race issue. And so they laid out some things that they felt that Lyndon Baines Johnson should do. Like, how can we fix it? What do Black folks want? What can we do to get them to stop and get in line? They really kind of focused on three things. They said, one is around Black neighborhoods. And if we pour money into the Black community, if we truly make it a point to get rid of what we now call fast food swamps and fresh fruit deserts, if we set up green spaces in the communities, if we get the lead poisoning out of the communities, if we have space where they can sit on their porch and they can be safe in their own, if we can stop some of the ways in which we are policing the communities, if pour money into the Black neighborhood. Two, pour money into the Black schools, the inner city schools, like pour money into making sure they have the resources that they need, that the schools are bright and fun and lively places, like pour money into the schools. That way we can bring up the educational levels of inner city African-American people, neighborhoods, schools. And they said, you know what? Close the wage pay gap. Pay Black folks exactly what their white counterparts are making. Same experience, same background, pay them their money, like run them their change is what they were saying. Do these three things: neighborhood, schools, wage pay gap. If you do that, we can bring this country together. Lyndon Baines Johnson rejected the Kerner Commission study. In fact, they said he was upset. Like, what else do I have to do for Black folks? So he rejected that. Now, I want to make a note here, kind of do a footnote, that when you talk about the wage pay gap, it was stated in the Kerner Commission in 1968, but that was not their terminology, right? When you talk about neighborhoods and schools, it was in the Kerner Commission, but they're not the ones that put that together. You got to go back to 1963 with the March on Washington. Like, you got to go back there, right? You got to get back to the March on Washington to understand why this was important, because it was a March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And three of the things they were talking about was pouring money into the Black community, pour money into our schools, and giving us a wage increase. Now, if you do the math today, they were saying raise us to $15 because $15, of course, lifts people up out of the poverty level. Even then, they were saying $15 minimum. You do the math and do the exchange for the dollar today, it's $15. It was rejected in 1968 from Lyndon Baines Johnson. That study was redone 30 years later in 1998 under the Eisenhower Foundation. They came together, brought white men together and said, take a look at what they said 30 years ago. Let's do a intellectual study, right? Let's talk about philosophical study, an economic study. How have things changed since 1998? Are we doing better now than we were in 1968? And this group of all white men, the Eisenhower Foundation in 1998, came out and said America is Blacker and browner and poorer than ever. We're more divided today in 1998 than we were in 1968, because in 1968, they were forcing white folks to segregate, to integrate. They were forcing it to happen. By 1998, people were settling their own communities. You had the white flight taking place, you had the schools going down, you had the flooding of our community with all kinds of things designed to keep us from moving ahead. You have the rise and the establishment of the mass industrial prison complex that Michelle Alexander lays out in the new Jim Crow. All of that was happening. And in 1998, they said, we're really more separated, but we can do some things to bring this country together. Now, they outline a series of steps that could be taken, but I just want to point out 3 that they put back on the study. 1998, talked about in 1968, mentioned in 1963. If you pour money into the Black neighborhood, like let's actually set up green spaces, make them safer, stop all of the over-policing that's taking place so people can be safe in their homes and they can feel proud of their communities. If you pour money into the inner city schools, to the Black schools, the predominantly Black population schools, and you get them up to par, so they're getting the same resources that their county colleagues are getting. And if you close the stinking wage pay gap, pay Black and brown folks what their white colleagues are making, if you do that, we can bring this country together. 1998. Now, that was not put forward to the president as like, this is something we should do. It was put forth as a policy plan, rejected, of course. It was done one more time. And I want to lay this out before I move on. It's done one more time. And in laying this out, do understand that race, as Ta-Nehisi Coates states, he says it's the child of racism and not the father. I go a little bit farther, right? So if race is the child of racism and not the father, then racism has to be the cousin to white supremacy and white domestic terrorism. Like it's got to be the cousin to that, because racism exists and stays in place and sets up the notion of race because they got their cousins doing the work, right? The cousins you call when Black kids are selling water. You got your cousins to come and move Black people from Central Park. You got your cousins to come and stop Black folks from jogging, right? And it's the cousins, the twin cousins around white supremacy and white domestic terrorism. The study was done one more time. And it was done in 2018. It was kind of a 50-year retrospect, looking back at the Kerner Commission. A very diverse committee, people of all different races, genders, ethnicities came together. And it was, it was published in the New York Times. You could take a look at it. It was a great study of saying, how is America doing, right? It's been 50 years since Kerner. How are we doing? In 2018, may I just gently remind you of who our president was in 2018. May I gently remind you of the number of white women primarily calling the cops on Black folks for just living our lives. Let me gently remind you of all the white supremacy and white supremacist acts that were taking place in 2018. So when the study came out, they laid out maybe 9 or 10 things that could be done to bring this country together, to close the racial gap, the economic gap that existed. It was so entrenched in our society. I just want to point out 3 of them, right? Pour money into the Black neighborhood. Now, when we talk about that, I'm in Baltimore City. Baltimore City, when we talk about these racially restrictive housing codes, we're considered to be ground zero. Because in Baltimore City in 1910, you had the most racist housing policies that were ever enacted. It started here, where it red-lined Black communities and it green and blue-lined predominantly white communities. Green-lined white communities meant they set up green space, wide sidewalks, parks, trees, to make sure you can walk and be healthy and be safe in your communities. They don't police those communities. They serve and protect the green line and blue line communities. The red line communities were predominantly Black, economically challenged communities. They were communities where you had concrete jungles. They were denying, mortgages to Black folks that lived in that community. And what we saw starting in 1910 was also the introduction and the erosion of the pipe system. So you had lead being seeped into the soil in the land. You're talking, we have generations of Black folks in Baltimore who've been lead poisoned, Freddie Gray being one of them. They said, pour money into the Black neighborhood. Let's shut off the pipeline and let's clean up the neighborhood so they're safe. Let's put grocery stores in the neighborhood. Let's give people access and a fighting chance. They said, come on, let's pour money into the Black schools. Let's stop policing inner city schools. Let's stop sending cops into the schools rather than counselors. Let's stop sending cops into Black neighborhoods rather than, domestic violence counselors. Let's stop over policing our children and setting it up that there's a pipeline between the classroom and the prison, a pipeline they say only exists within economically challenged, predominantly Black schools. Pour money into the school system. And then third, of course, close the wage pay gap. Now, just 2 days ago, we had Equal Pay Day, where it's a day when they say all women catch up to what white men made in 1 year. If white men make $1, Equal Pay Day was just 2 days ago where women caught up. Not women. I want to be clear, white women, let's be very, very clear. Black women don't catch up until August 3rd. Indigenous women don't catch up until September. And Hispanic women don't catch up till October. Like, it takes us a year, 8, 9, 10 months to make what our white counterparts make in 1 year. Close the wage pay gap, where at this moment, only white men make $1 on $1, and Asian American men, when you take into account, of course, all the disparities within the Asian American community, are making $1.11 to $1.15. And Black women are still making 69 cents. Black men are making 89 cents. I mean, Indigenous women are into 55 cents. Hispanic women are into 32 cents. Like, we do this idea of what the work means and what it looks like. Every conversation is a conversation about race, even when it's not. And I would argue that the work that we need to do for how we would go forward is to figure out 3 things, and then I'll throw it back to Dr. Johnson. 3 things I want to point out. And I know that we're all using this term anti-racism, like that's the buzzword now, right? Everybody's anti-racist, where you have babynames.com publishing the names of Black folks who've been killed by the police, unarmed Black folks. You have, WNBA players wearing Breonna Taylor t-shirts. You had NFL players with Breonna Taylor's name and George Floyd's name on the back of their helmet. Everybody's anti-racist. Nike's released tennis shoes with Dr. King quotes hanging on them. Come on, Starbucks has a red, black, and green cup. Everybody's anti-racist, except that they're not. Because anti-racism has nothing to do with Black slogans, Black Lives Matter t-shirts, participating in the Black Lives Matter march where everybody's white, but we are saying Black Lives Matter. That's not being anti-racist. Anti-racism is about standing up against racist policies, practices, procedures, and laws. It's standing up and then doing something about it. You just can't say the Georgia Crow laws are wrong. You got to be able to go to Georgia. You got to be able to write a check, take down some water in a cooler, be able to meet people where they are to help in this situation, because it'll start in Georgia and it'll spread across the land. Being anti-racist means you have to learn the history, that Black folks should not be your internal Wikipedia to tap on whenever you have a question about what's going on. There are enough books, from Michelle Alexander's A New Jim Crow to Miriam Cobble, We Do This Till We Free Us, till Angela Davis, Our Prisons Obsolete, to Ibram Kendi's Stamp from the Beginning. Like, there are enough books. And there's this wonderful, wonderful place called the World Wide Web. Go educate yourself. Figure out the history of race. And then finally, you got to figure out where you sit with this question. See, I always ask people, I ask white folks to look themselves in the mirror and ask yourself, look, am I racist? And you close the door if you have to. Don't have anybody else in the room so you're not embarrassed, but really ask yourself, am I racist? Now, prior to Ibram Kendi's Candy book, How to Be Anti-Racist, I would say, I want white folks to ask themselves the question. Ibram Kendi and I had a big conversation, and he disagrees with me. Because you know what? Everybody needs to look themselves in the mirror. Because if you're a Black person, and you refuse to charge police officers for killing Breonna Taylor in their home, even if you're Black, you're being racist in that moment. If you're a Black person and you're sitting on the Supreme Court and you're signing off on laws and documentations that oppress Black people, you are being racist at that moment. Not just practicing anti-Blackness, you're being racist because you're tied into the policies, practices, laws, and procedure. Dr. King said, and this is where I'll close, Dr. King said there were 3 evils that had to be dismantled if we want to have true equality and justice in this land. He said the evil of poverty, the evil of militarism, talking about cops and the military, and the evil of racism. He said 3 evils. I'm making the argument that there's a 4th evil. And the 4th evil, I would argue, is the hearts and minds of people. Because if we could change that, then we can work on the other things. Until we get into the hearts and minds of people, then nothing else will ever change. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaye, for this message that, wow, this is such a call to action. We have some wonderful questions here. Let's see here. I want to start with the question that I think we all probably grapple with as Black people. I know I grapple with it every day. Baldwin often critiqued the notion of racial progress. And I think we're all kind of grapple with this question. Are we better off at this moment, socially, economically, politically, given the history that you've laid out in this backlash, this constant struggle for freedom? Where are we now?
That's a very good question, and it's one actually that my students and I talk about a lot. Because I teach millennials who are amazing and wonderful and just brilliant and bright, and they are our future that will probably save us all. But they often wonder, we have not grown, nothing has changed. It feels like we're running in place, and I push back against that. I push back against that as a member of the sandwich generation, growing up with a father who was part of the civil rights movement in Jim Crow, South Carolina. My father, who would go out for a march and would not grab Starbucks on the way to the Black Lives Matter march. He said he would go and he would say goodbye to his mother, knowing that he might not make it home, that they would have somebody holding the bag for money to help get people out of jail. It wasn't about having parties and face painting at marches. It was about the sense that you actually might die when you deal with Jim Crow. It was about understanding that you would rather die than continue to live. It was about making the sacrifice for the future generation. That war that the last Jim Crow generation fought, and I want to make a note that the research shows that the white folks from the last Jim Crow generation not only voted for Donald Trump, but they also financially supported Donald Trump. But that last Jim Crow generation dealt with racism in a very different way than we deal with it today. It is a lot more subtle today. It is based into policies and practices, procedures, not in law today. Those were the things that they fought to end. They fought to end Jim Crow, not just fighting on the streets with protesting, but also fighting in the courtroom. I mean, let's not, discount the work that Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley did, for example, to get Jim Crow into the courtrooms, get it all the way up to the Supreme Court and have it wiped out there. It was also making sure the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, which we found are not guaranteed, but they worked to put it there. Our generation, and I'm a Generation Xer, and I say that with a lot of pride, that we stand between the boomers and millennials and zillennials, like we always are like the middle child trying to keep racial, unity going. But our generation didn't fight that bad. I mean, when I meet people my age, we were not out fighting. We were babies. We weren't fighting and doing civil rights movement marches. Our biggest thing was a divestment of companies coming out of apartheid South Africa. And with Black Lives Matter, those were our children, our teenagers involved in that. But even when we look with the long eye of history, we know that the struggle is similar, but it's not the same. It's similar, but it's not the same. There are a lot of people who have problems with Barack Obama's presidency. I get that. His political stance aside, the drones aside, right? The fact that a Black man was elected in this country is a huge sign of racial progress. Now, we know that we weren't living in a non-racial society, there's no racial blindness, but that's something that happened. The fact that Kamala Harris is vice president of this country as a brown woman, and she fills so many of the spots, not just as a Black woman, not just as an Asian American, but she fills so many of the spots. The fact that happened on the backs and work of Black women like Stacey Abrams, Keisha Lance Bottoms, Muriel Bottoms. We can keep going with all the Black women who are mayors, but also politically active. The fact that we can have Marsha Fudge, my soror, stand up in the White House. She's dictating policy and making sure everyone's awake and respecting her and speaking back to her. It means that even though we are still in the midst of the war, there are battlegrounds that we have won. And I don't think that it's respectful to discount the sacrifice that our ancestors and our parents made to get us where we are. The question I ask people, and I wrestle with Baldwin around racial progress. I do. James Baldwin, who's living in France, talking about racial progress here on the ground, right? We got to talk about that. But I wrestle with that, knowing that we accept Bayard Rustin today in a different way than Bayard Rustin as a Black gay man was accepted during that time. Why? Because we have fought that battle. There's been levels of acceptance in our community, the work that, you know, queer Black women have done to move movements forward that can work now that may not have worked in 1964. That there's a big struggle. We're still dismantling white supremacy, but we have a lot more to add to the table, that we're not just marching in the streets, we are fighting it in every single baseline because of the progress that was done before.
Thanks for that. We have another question. What do you think about organizations such as Coming to the Table, who bring together people who want to acknowledge and heal wounds from racism that is rooted in slavery and white supremacy?
Well, I will say that as a PK, you know, I'm all into healing. I mean, I've done the accountability circles, the holding hands, let's come and let's talk. You know, this is just a personal statement. I am a little bit tired of crying together and praying together and holding hands. Look, just recognize that you come from a racist society, is socialized in a racist world, and like, yeah, let's get the work done. I think that the healing that needs to take place, I believe the healing has to be with progress. That, you know, you personally healing and feeling better, that's great. I just no longer have the time for that. I just can't cry any more tears as we're all kind of coming together and coming to grips with our own feelings of racism and anti-Blackness. Like, do that on your own time. And then let's come to the table and work. Come to the table, Generation Xers, and bring your checkbook. So if you can't march, fund the organizations that can. Like, you got jobs. So if you can't get out in the streets, then you know what? Fund lawyers for young people who are out in the streets. So if they get arrested, we got money to get them out. We have money to get them a lawyer. If you can't march, then fund getting, you know, gift cards so they can get coffee and drinks while they're out there, blankets when they're out laying in the streets. Like, you can do something. Not just write an op-ed, which is great. Not just teach a class, which is great. What else are you doing? Are you leaning in with your privilege? And you're bending it. I think it's great to have healing service. Go ahead and come to the table. I personally am not going to any more tables unless the table is going to deal with solutions and doing work. The individual acts of restoration, there are people that do that. I'm not a counselor. I do diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And training means we're getting ready to go out in the streets. So you're figuring out how you can bend your privilege. Go get healed, yes. Except that one of the things I've learned as the daughter of someone who works with mothers who, you know, deal with healing. Healing takes a long time. Do we have to wait until you're healed before we can get you to work? Or while you're healing, can you get some things done? So keep going and get healing, keep going to therapy, and then let's get the work done, because we need many hands to make the work right. Like, we got to keep moving forward. And I say it the way my grandmother would say it. I don't think racism is going to change for me. I don't think white supremacy is going to end in my lifetime. I just want to be very clear about that. And I'm not a pessimist, right? I'm, you know what, let me go back. I'm a pessimist with optimist leanings. I'll say that. I don't think white supremacy is going to end in my lifetime. I don't think white supremacy is going to end in the lifetime of my children. I have an 18-year-old and a 20-year-old. They grew up, you know, Black Lives Matter, climate control, gun control. It's not going to end for them. I'm doing the work today for the children of my children. I don't have time to stop and do a whole lot of healing because I'm doing the work for the children of my children. So when they pick up the banner, at least I've taken it a little bit farther down the path. But they're not starting at the same place that I started.
During these moments of white lash, I mean, that's when frustration starts to mount, particularly with activists and those who are really engaged on the front line. And we've seen this at many intervals in history, as you've laid out. What do we do during that moment when this other level of violence is taking place? Some insight in terms of how do we respond during that time?
It's interesting because I argue that nobody is more dangerous than white people who believe that they're losing everything. And I quite clearly can use the research to back up what I'm saying, since we know that all the sociological research shows that the face of domestic terror in this country is a white man between the ages of 19 and 44, who feel comfortable going into places, blowing everybody away, from schools to McDonald's to, you know, naval bases. That there's something that has been created in this society. This is what I'm talking about, the post-traumatic plantation owner syndrome. There's something that's been created in this country It has led white people writ large, not individual white folks that we know, white people writ large, to believe that as Black people and brown people progress, then they are digressing. I think that is very important. Like, that's something psychological to believe that there's not enough food for everybody. I'd rather people go hungry than be asked to share. Because if I share, then I can potentially end up with nothing. Like that is this idea of manifest destiny. That's this idea of capitalism, that we've led people from as early as children to say it's okay that their people are hungry as long as you can eat. Like that's a psychological problem here, one that really is not rooted in our community, because we existed and we survived because we recognize if I have one piece of bread, if I split it into 4 pieces, 4 people can eat. That I'm not losing anything by making sure other people eat. Like, this notion around whiteness that is also rooted not just in white supremacy and white domestic terrorism, it's rooted in capitalism. It's rooted in this belief that there's not enough to go around to everyone. That I can call myself a Christian. Like, when you talk about religious theory being wrapped up in this, you call yourself a Christian, but yet you are oppressing people. I don't understand that as a PK. Like, part of Christianity is about share. We say we're a Christian nation when we want to control what women can do with their bodies. But we don't act like that when it comes to sharing, when it comes to dividing equally, when it comes to equity and justice. We are living in very perilous and dangerous times. And I tell people, this is the time when you have to get built up. This is the time when you have to protect yourself, because there's a huge shift that is happening in this country. I call it the last gasp of the racist dragon. And let me tell you why I say that, not just as a slogan. I say it because the US Census predicts that by 2040, whites will be in the minority. I know it, you know it, and you can best believe that whites in power are figuring it out as well, which is why, if you look at the policies, what they are setting up is an apartheid system. Like, we can use the history of South Africa to show us what does it look like to set up an apartheid system. That Georgia Crow law, that is an apartheid system being laid out, because you're disenfranchising a huge swath of the population, predominantly Black people, predominantly immigrants. Like, that's what apartheid looks like. So if you don't think that that's what they're leaning towards, they know they're going to be in the minority. Why? It's not that birth rates are down in the Black community. We remain flat in terms of our numbers. Birth rates have gone down in the white community. So they understand where they're going. And what they're setting up is the notions to put in place to get the 22 and the 24 election. We are living in dangerous and perilous times. And we're also watching the price that Black activists are paying speaking up in this country. You speak up in this country, you're risking at least 3 things possibly happen. 1, you're risking them killing you. And if you go back and look at the research, you can actually see the number of Black Lives Matter activists who are now dead coming after Trayvon Martin. 2, you can end up having them begin to dig into your life so they can put you on the line, finding something in your background to then embarrass you and get you to step down. Or 3, you can end up with them following you, tagging your phone, making sure you don't move forward. That there's a price to pay for speaking out against this military capitalist regime in this country, which is fueled by white. I say get built up. I say what Bell Hooks said. She said she never travels anywhere without a crew with her. She's like, I need witnesses if something happens to me. And if you speak out in this country, if you stand up in this country, more than writing a check, right? More than a banner, more than a t-shirt. If you really are saying you are working to dismantle whiteness and white supremacy in this country, then you're setting yourself up to be a target. And you have to make a decision. If what you are willing to die for is worth you living at this moment, because that's what it comes down to. And it may sound really pessimistic. I'm sorry, I think we're in a life or death struggle, because what we're trying to kill is whiteness that's been born, bred, fed, and supported in the system since 1619.
Wow. I have another question. I think we have a few moments left, and it kind of follows on what you just stated. So could you talk a bit more about this date in terms of 1619, and why is 1619 one of the more generally established at this moment, as this moment of arrival or the beginning of American slavery?
I'm laughing because Nicole Hannah-Jones had the power of the New York Times behind her. So I'm saying when you put out the 1619 project, which was a massive project, and it was so well done, and it was pushed on every single aspect. 1619 was pushed forward because that is the documented time, the year when 20 or so, and we always say 20 or so odd Africans because that's what it says actually in the books, right? 20 or so odd Africans arrived in this country, connected with the permanent American settlements. For many people, that marked the beginning of Africans in America, different from 1444 when it was still under Spanish rule. Like when you think about slavery at that time, it wasn't the same thing. It's also different if you talk about the book Before the Mayflower. It talks about Africans coming in and out of the Americas doing trade. We're talking about enslaved people who have a very distinct and unique history in this country. And so 1619, if it had been pushed forward in my book, for example, if it had been pushed forward by the Afro or pushed forward by the Washington Post, it would not have the same resonance. I mean, the New York Times is a juggernaut in this country. Nicole Hannah-Jones works for the juggernaut. And the juggernaut said that we are going to wrap a whole curriculum, a whole movement around 1619. It was massive when you think about it, not just the build up to the release of it, but also the strategic way it was marketed. Like either you were on 1619 or you were not. It got to the point where they had the little buttons where they crossed out, 1776 and put up 1619. That led to Nicole Hannah-Jones winning the Pulitzer Prize. Like this is huge. But they had to get behind that. Now, what's been found afterwards were a lot of contradictions, right? In some of the writings from the 1619 project, some of the things we're saying, okay, you said this, and we know that it's actually this. I argue, and I say this, with a lot of respect for Nicole, but I argue that there's a difference, and I want y'all not to take this the wrong way. There's a difference between reporters telling our history and historians documenting our history. There is a difference. I stand in a unique space. I'm a trained historian. I study Black women's history. I study the history of social movements. I mean, my PhD is focused on Black women's history. My early books are all about Black women from the 1860s and the movement around economic production. I'm a historian. I call myself a herstory, but I'm a historian. But I also write an op-ed column for the Afro. And when I sit down to write an op-ed column, I can't write all the history in 750 words. So I'm going with the slogans. Ask yourself if what you're willing to die for is what you're willing to live for. Trying to put footnotes in there that'll throw people back to the work. Reporters did the 1619 at a white economic capitalist newspaper company. And it was marketed as such and marketed well. Historians did not. And I think the 1619 project will continue to be disputed, but it has been cemented as that moment to think about the first 20 or so odd Africans who were either indentured servants or enslaved people. So Nicole Hannah-Jones in the 1619 project asserts that they were enslaved, but the documentation is not clear because we know at least some of them 7 years later, they had their own land, which if you were establishing your own land 7 years later, you were an indentured servant and not an enslaved person, not in terms of chattel slavery. So I think that these little pieces that have to be broken down were not completely explored, particularly in the essays that became the more popular essays. If you really spend time reading the entire 1619 magazine and you read the newspaper supplement that they published with that gets into the work of say Ma Bett, the Black woman who sued Massachusetts for her freedom. Like if you read them together, you'll see that they had people in there wrestling with the history, but those were not the popular pieces that everyone shared.
Well, unfortunately, we've reached our time. This has been absolutely great. Thank you so much, Dr. Whitehead, for your insight. It's been a wonderful moment, and I think some people are giving virtual applause here. We welcome you to do that. Also, I want to note that these lectures, our discussions will be on YouTube. So we do have links to that. Also follow our social media platforms and you will see links to the YouTube videos. Again, thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Thank you, Dr. Kaye. Enjoy the rest of this morning, this afternoon. I think Dr. Allen, I don't know if she has something to say.
You muted.
No, I wasn't. I was just saying waving bye. I couldn't find my hand clap. Sorry.
Thank you. I want to say something to Nicole Duncan Talley. Thank you. She said, so glad I was here with my mom for this. Thank you so much. It has been an honor and a privilege. I will say that you were the last activity standing between my spring break. So I am happy to end off Women's History Month with you. Reach out to me. Dr. Johnson has my material and my information, but I'm more than happy to share resources, share book titles. I think the best thing we can do is to share what we know with others so that they can then share it with other people. So thank you.